In the meantime, economist and the former presidential advisor on economy, Dr. Doyin Salami, says the reforms of the Tinubu's administration will be painful but had to be consistently done and focus on key areas. Delivering a keynote address today at that Nigerian-British Chamber of Commerce breakfast meeting, Dr. Salami says there is urgent need to focus on agro-industrialization, strong external account, higher output against money supply, and a stable exchange rate.
Reform is not without a cost. And at the heart of, in my view, of the government's challenge is going to be how does it first sequence the reforms, second, manage the cost of reform. Because if nobody knows anything, fuel prices went up from 200 to 600, it's part of the reform. The president in his comment said, are we going to see higher fuel prices? That is a question that perhaps only government can answer. If I was to say anything, it would be in a liberalized market, your fuel price will be driven by three things and three things only. Three things only. The first is what's the price of fuel? The second, if we're importing it, what's the exchange rate? If we're not importing it, it depends on at what price the producers, now we have the Dangote refinery in operation. And of course, the third piece will always be taxation. Is there any taxes? And so ordinarily, if global crude oil prices move up and down, fuel prices will move up and down. By how much? It depends. And that's why I say that's where the policy makers' intervention. And some would argue that, look, part of the challenge we faced before now in not taking out fuel subsidy fully before it was done is simply that we ended up borrowing to pay subsidies. If you look at the numbers now, the FARC numbers have gone up quite significantly. And so when you say, where are we? At the beginnings of reform. But the context of the reform is an economy growing, let's not misunderstand that, growing, but unstable. Stability in any economy sits on a tripod. What's the tripod? It's a tripod that measures, first, where is your output? Is your output growing faster than your population? If your output is not growing as fast as your population, then income per head will come down. It's as simple and as straightforward as that. Indeed, I draw attention to something which I think that we might potentially benefit from. In 1990, Nigeria's income per head as an economy was bigger than that of China's. 1990. Nigeria was, I think, about 586. Please don't quote me specifically on this, but it's a ratio, roughly 586. The Chinese were about 380, thereabout. Today, even with a larger population, 5-6 times ours, they are headed $12,000. We are trying $2,000. What happened? It's very simple. They rode the third industrial revolution aggressively. That's what happened. And so that's the point about your productivity must be bigger, grow faster than your population. That's the only way you grow your income. So that's the first leg. Second leg, costs must be stable. And for Nigeria, indeed for most countries, there are two dimensions or two domains of cost. First is inflation, second is exchange rate. So that's why the point about exchange rate stability. You see, I not misunderstanding levels where people say, what's going to be the price of the exchange rate? Of foreign currency, because the price is the exchange rate. I'm much more particular about how stable is it. And typically what has happened to Nigeria is really very simple. We hold and then we drop. We hold and then we drop. Whereas what we perhaps need to see is an exchange rate that is more in tune with the forces of demand and supply. Please don't misunderstand me. Every country in the world manages its exchange rate. How they do it is a different matter. But nobody, quote unquote, leaves exchange rates, to whatever you like. It's a very important price. And so for me, what's important is that stability. By the way, for most of us here, we would like a strong currency. Why? Our obligations. We have significant obligations in non-Naira. We have significant non-Naira obligations. But guess what? As the currency strengthens, so do you export jobs. Because a strong currency affects your competitiveness. It's important to understand this, that yes, for me personally, I would like the Naira to be very strong. Why? I have school fees to pay. There are medicals to pay. There are house mortgages to service. But if this economy is going to grow the number of jobs that it needs, the UN projects that we're going to be 400 million plus people by 2050. Question is, where will you find the jobs? And let me be very clear, Nigeria's job prospects are to be found in building a robust agro-industrial complex. Please understand that. What does that mean? We've got to build an agro-industrial complex where agriculture provides the feedstock for manufacturing. One of the fundamental weaknesses of where we are today, when you look at the Nigeria Bureau of Statistics numbers, only 6% of Nigeria's labor force is in the formal sector. 93% or thereabout is in the informal sector. So you need to begin to formalize this economy. We need to understand that informal sector, by the way, but we need to formalize the sector, the rest of the economy, so that's the only way government intervention can actually be more deliberate and more effective. This is Nigeria's inflation. The red is the US's inflation. That gap, when people say, what's going to happen to the exchange rate? I say, I don't know. I don't ever predict exchange rates. If I wasn't taught anything in economics at master's and postgraduate level, I was taught never to predict oil prices and predict exchange rates. So I don't. Liquidity, money supply, grew last 8 years on average 14-15% per annum. Output growth was 1.2% per annum. Go back to O.A. Lawal. Too much money chasing too few goods. I hope you understand me. That's the challenge. And by the way, look at the graph below. What that is showing you it's it's not that difficult to understand. On the one hand, all the red pieces are bond yields in different countries. All the blue pieces are inflation. Look at Nigeria, inflation well above bond yields. I hope you can see that. So I've already shown you this one, which says if it's like this, the currency is likely to move in a particular direction, so don't be surprised people are looking for foreign currency. But look here, if yields are significantly lower than inflation, then why do you want to keep your money in Naira assets? Again, it goes back to that point about the imperative of managing aggressively inflation downwards. What do I think is going to happen in terms of the global economy? Remember I said it affects the domestic economy. The global economy is slow. The rate of growth globally is still looking at about 2.5%. And guess what? 2.5% is historically very low. Indeed, 2.5% is almost a global recession. And the key countries that are really pulling their weight, the Americans, surprisingly, we didn't expect them to do what they have done in 2023, but we expect that the American economy will cool down in the course of 2024. The simple reason, monetary policy is tight and it's going to remain tight. The Chinese have their own problems, still growing at about 5%, but with the asset bubble in the real estate market, it's not doing the kind of 6-7% that we've been used to. The one country that seems to be actually pulling its weight really at the moment is India. The Indians are really growing. For Africa, we're looking at, I think, an average of about 3.5%, just under 4% is what the African average looks like. But global inflation is still high. It's coming down, by the way. It was 9, it's come down to 6, but even at 6, it's still higher than what it was pre-COVID, which is why global monetary policy is likely to remain tight. Global monetary policy remains tight. If you're looking to so you have two questions to ask yourself. One, what happens to the Naira? But an even more interesting question is what happens to the dollar? Not against the Naira, but against other currencies. What happens to the dollar will depend on when or if the US Fed starts to cut its rates. How quickly, how deeply. When that cut starts, the dollar will weaken. But for as long as that cut doesn't start and US interest rates still remain, as the analysts